"Can you cover the dinner bill? You can't get this dish just anywhere." That's what my mother-in-law says, as she charges an amount like that of a fancy restaurant, but the food in question was just everyday home cooking used for a work photo shoot. I was left speechless. I didn't want to deal with this kind of in-law family, but one problem after another kept coming. My name is Catherine Parker. I'm 29 and work at a publishing company. I chase the latest trends every day with my husband Bob, who's a fashion magazine editor. We met during a work interview. When I was assigned to feature popular hair salons, I visited the top-rated ones, based on online reviews for interviews. The most highly recommended was a certain salon. That's where my husband worked. The skills of the hairstylists were impressive, and it made sense why they were so popular. All the staff were so pleasant, and the treatment felt like it was over in no time. I loved the salon so much that I decided to get my hair cut there even after the feature was finished. During the interview, the stylist who answered most enthusiastically was my husband, Bob. We both found out we loved indie films and got excited, promising to go watch one together. That's how our relationship started, and within about a year, we considered getting married. But little did we know there were significant issues with Bob's family. Not just for us as a couple, but even my family got dragged into it. When we went to greet Bob's family, I found out for the first time that Bob's mother was a fairly well-known cooking influencer. Her YouTube videos, which taught old-fashioned home cooking recipes in a simple way for young people, had gone viral. Viewers seemed to love watching the graceful middle-aged mother-in-law happily teaching her young, inexperienced assistant. The comment section was filled with praises like, "I wish my mother-in-law was like her and sir. This is way more helpful than imitating my nagging real mom." So not knowing who she was hurt her pride. "Even though you're in editing, you don't know about me? You really should keep up." She looked annoyed, and I panicked. I was worried that I had upset my mother-in-law, but after sincerely apologizing, she was sweet for the rest of our visit. I felt relieved. My mother-in-law even encouraged our marriage, and I thought there wouldn't be any mother-in-law issues. But my father-in-law seemed more difficult. He just sat silently sipping his tea. And when he finally did speak, he had concerning things to say. "You might want to think more about marriage." We were puzzled. What could be the issue? It said that my father-in-law is stubborn, and often frustrates both family members and those around him. If he's opposing without any particular reason, then we're at a loss. At a loss. My husband frowned. "Why not give a reason? Mom's on our side. We're gonna get married." At my husband's words, my father-in-law grimaced and abruptly left the room. I stayed silent, but started to worry if he was dissatisfied with me as his future daughter-in-law. My mother-in-law looked at me and smiled. "Don't worry, he'll come around eventually." Her comforting words touched my heart. My husband also looked at my mother-in-law with trusting eyes. It was clear that in this family only my father-in-law was the odd one out. I know it's hard with Dad opposing us, but we'll try our best to get his approval. My husband repeatedly assured me that there wasn't any issue. Catherine is the one I chose. Dad has no right to interfere. I felt reassured by my husband's words. From then on, my husband and my mother-in-law persistently tried to persuade my husband. During this, my husband shared something with me. Dad suddenly said he wanted to talk without Mom around, probably because he knew she'd side with Catherine. That's kind of petty. I felt the same way at that time. But it turned out, my father-in-law had a completely different reason. Finally, my husband declared that if this marriage didn't go through, he would remain single for the rest of his life. Only then did my father-in-law relent, and so we made it to our wedding day. Our new home was in an apartment just nearby my in-laws' house, an apartment my father-in-law owned. We were filled with happiness. I resolved to do my best to get along with my in-laws and be a good wife. One weekend, my in-laws came to visit. Regarding our marriage, there's another piece of happy news. Actually, I'm going to be opening a new restaurant. I genuinely admired my mother-in-law's talent. My husband was grinning with joy, but for some reason, my father-in-law wore a frown. It really put a damper on the mood. "Don't you approve? It's not fair to your wife if you don't," I blurted out to my father-in-law. My father-in-law let out a big sigh and muttered, "I'm going to collect some rent." With the family finally together, he selfishly took off on his own. Once my father-in-law was gone, my mother-in-law began to explain. "It's hard for me to say, Catherine, but I earn more than him, and he doesn't like it." "I'm sorry," I shook my head. It wasn't her fault. It's ridiculous that a grown man like my father-in-law is being so petty and selfish. From what I heard from my mother-in-law, my father-in-law has a chronic illness and hasn't been able to work for a long time. Now, he just manages an apartment building they invested in. Growing up, my husband always saw his hardworking father as a role model. Hardworking mother, and felt lonely. He wished my mother-in-law could be home like the mothers in other families. My father-in-law was always home, but my father-in-law wasn't the type to play with him due to his illness. Over time, my husband came to believe that my mother-in-law had to work because of my father-in-law. Since my husband was young, he's had a resentment towards my father-in-law. "He's a grumpy old man. Just ignore him," he'd say dismissively. Even my mother-in-law didn't deny it. A few days later, my mother-in-law called. "Catherine, your family runs a sushi restaurant, right?" "Our place is a pretty popular high-end sushi restaurant. We've been featured on TV and in magazines more than once or twice. Currently, not only my parents but also my brother and his wife run the restaurant together. If it were just like the old days with only my parents, I'd invite you over without hesitation. The second and third floors of the restaurant are living quarters. My parents live on the second floor, and my brother, his wife, and their kids live on the third floor." I mentioned that it's a bit hard to relax and visit often because of my sister-in-law and the kids. My mother-in-law responded, "I understand." She then asked various questions like where we source our top quality fish and how business has been. I casually told her everything I knew. "It'd be great if we could all visit sometime," my mother-in-law said. I told her I'd check our restaurant's schedule and get back to her. I didn't care much about my father-in-law's opinion, but I really wanted my mother-in-law to enjoy our sushi. Though our conversation seemed fine, for some reason, starting the next day, my mother-in-law began ignoring me. It felt like our frequent interactions had been a lie. Today I messaged her before work, saying I was going to stand in line at a renowned pastry shop and get her favorite jelly dessert, which my mother-in-law had requested, but she left my message unread. Later after work I reported back. Unfortunately, they were out of the jelly dessert, but would you like me to get some of the famous cakes instead? No matter how many times I messaged her, she didn't read them. Finally, when I tried calling, to my surprise, she had blocked my number. I was baffled since I hadn't done anything wrong. It was my mother-in-law who had learned about a famous pastry shop near my workplace and had insisted I get something from there. Despite that, she treated me this way. I felt a mix of confusing emotions. When I confided in my husband, he strangely blamed me, saying, "Did you say something rude to my mom?" I was annoyed. I was bewildered precisely because I hadn't said anything wrong. I was planning to gift those popular pastries. After all, we've always been indebted to them, and I genuinely wanted to please my mother-in-law. I worked hard to do so. When I got upset at my husband's harsh words, he began to suggest that maybe I was the one in the wrong. As I stayed silent, not understanding what he meant, my husband bitterly repeated what he had heard from his mother. I told my mother-in-law that she is just an amateur with a tad bit of knowledge about cooking. She wouldn't recognize good sushi if she had it. She shouldn't even come to our restaurant. Apparently, I was accused of speaking ill about my mother-in-law. Apparently, my mother-in-law lied to my husband, painting me as the villain. Even when I insisted I would never say something so terrible, my husband wouldn't believe me. I was baffled and overwhelmed, wondering how things got to this point. From then on, the spitefulness from my mother-in-law intensified. Although she works as a culinary researcher, my mother-in-law is incredibly stingy. For instance, she never shares the dishes she prepares for her shows with the staff. She packs everything into containers and takes it all home. Not just that, she also takes home any leftover ingredients or condiments provided for her. The staff are all taken aback, but they are too scared of my mother-in-law to say anything. After all, my mother-in-law is the kind of person who has no problem making abusive and bullying remarks. "I bet y'all can't work just because I'm here." So every day, we eat the dishes my mother-in-law prepares for her shows at home. Even so, it's just regular home-cooked meals. She always demands gratitude. My husband just nods in agreement, completely brainwashed by her. My father-in-law remains silent as ever. I feel like I'm walking on eggshells. Once dinner is over, I'm ordered to do the dishes. When I finish and try to head home, my mother-in-law stops me. "Do you think you can just leave without paying? This isn't just any meal. It's special." Saying that, my mother-in-law extorts meal money from me. And it was an amount you would expect from a fancy restaurant. I'm left utterly speechless. "Don't you dare tell Bob about this." My mother-in-law always insists that I keep it a secret. I wish I could just cook myself, but my clueless husband is always in a good mood, eating my mother-in-law's meals. "She makes a mean home-cooked meal," he says with a satisfied look on his face. It seems he thinks that since I am working and my mother-in-law is cooking, I should be grateful for having one less chore to worry about. "You should be more thankful to my mom," he tells me, dead serious. I try to explain to him how cold my mother-in-law is to me and how I don't want to go to their house for dinner anymore. I didn't want to go to their place for meals, but he never got it. The stress was piling up, leading to constant migraines for me. Then a terrifying fact came to light. Right in front of our family's sushi place, my mother-in-law planned to open her own seafood restaurant. Of all places, why right in front of our restaurant? My mother-in-law seemed quite proud of her decision. After all, isn't this a neighborhood where even Catherine's family seems to be doing well? I bet I can do even better. This new seafood joint was aiming for the high-end crowd, the same kind our sushi place served. In other words, she planned to steal all our customers. How audacious! She had previously questioned me about our customer base, suppliers, and how well we were doing. Clearly, her intention from the start was to put us out of business. My parents confronted me, asking what on earth is going on. How could she plan to open a seafood restaurant, especially right in front of us? They said, if someone in the family is opening a place near our store, the least they could do is give us a heads up, or some sort of courtesy call, right? Indeed, they were right. However, I wasn't informed about any of this by my mother-in-law. Moreover, my father, with a bitter expression, said, "That's not the only thing." Can you believe it? My mother-in-law contacted our sushi restaurant supplier and managed to get a contract for her own restaurant. But what's even more audacious is that she requested the seafood restaurant's purchased goods to be billed to our sushi place. I was floored. Is your husband's mother-in-law trying to ruin us? Distraught, I buried my face in my hands. Just then, the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, my father-in-law was standing there. "I hope it's okay to come by," he said. When I asked about the sushi place, they told me to find you here. Seeing my father-in-law unexpectedly made me nervous. But noticing my tense expression, my father-in-law said, "Catherine, I'm really sorry about everything." My father-in-law apologized sincerely. There wasn't a hint of the usual gruff demeanor I had come to expect from him. I was taken aback as my father-in-law began to share his story. Starting with an apology for his consistent rude behavior, my father-in-law opened up about the feelings he had been holding on to. He shared how he had always been sickly since his youth, making it hard for him to hold down a job. That's when my mother-in-law stepped up to the plate, finding work to support them. He was truly grateful for that. However, as she gained fame, my mother-in-law became consumed by greed. At first, I tried hard to reason with her. Being so obsessed with making money and thinking only of one's own success is just wrong. After all, my mother-in-law's career was built on the backs of her staff and employees. Her staff and assistants. He told my mother-in-law time and time again that she needed to value her team, or there wouldn't be a future for her. But she wouldn't listen. As her obsession with money grew, she also became more tight-fisted. She'd cut corners with expenses, preaching about using organic and pesticide-free produce, while actually using cheaper imports from the local supermarket. Some of her more conscientious staff members spoke up about this, only to be met with my mother-in-law's wrath and bullying. This caused many of them to quit. My mother-in-law grew paranoid, thinking everyone was jealous of her success and out to criticize her. She was particularly harsh on younger women, often making them cry. My father-in-law could easily envision how my mother-in-law might treat any future daughter-in-law, and he was worried for me. That's why he had been hesitant about our marriage at first, knowing I'd be on the receiving end of my mother-in-law's nastiness. He had hoped to make my husband aware of my mother-in-law's true colors over time, but my husband always took my mother-in-law's side. Just as I had thought, my husband didn't listen to my father-in-law at all, so I had no choice but to give up. Because he couldn't work, my father-in-law always felt a sense of inferiority and wasn't able to build a strong bond with his son. From that point on, my father-in-law kept a close watch to ensure my mother-in-law didn't mistreat me. Is that so? I was filled with remorse. My father-in-law, whom I had mistakenly thought was just a stubborn old man, just laughed and said he did it on purpose, so it was all right. It was my father-in-law who told me and my parents about my mother-in-law's sneaky tactics. Well, let's go deal with that wicked witch. At that time, my oblivious mother-in-law was visiting our sushi restaurant with some relatives. I'm in a good mood today. Everyone eat up. She was ordering and eating high-end sushi one after another, treating her relatives to a feast. The relatives joyfully indulged in the sushi, and of course, so did my mother-in-law. It tastes just so-so. With this, my restaurant will surpass yours soon. After making quite a mess, my mother-in-law called my cell. I'm at your sushi place right now. I forgot my wallet, but you wouldn't charge family, would you? It's a bit awkward, but mother-in-law, we've declined your supply contract. You could hear my mother-in-law gasping on the other end. She seemed stunned that we knew. We're already at the restaurant. My father-in-law is here too. We've heard everything. My mother-in-law looked back. There we were, my parents, me and my father-in-law standing at the entrance. My mother-in-law put on a defiant attitude, but we were not afraid. Base, well, we're using the same suppliers after all, and we're family. It's only right that you cover the cost. She charges us for meals, but when it's her turn, she expects it to be free because we're family? That's just too selfish of my mother-in-law. If we're family, then our meals should also be free, right? We'll be needing a refund for all we've paid. My mother-in-law grimaced, showing her displeasure. How stingy can she be? That was special high-quality stuff. You should be thankful you got to eat it because of me. My father-in-law chimed in with a look of disdain. The staff have all been saying the same thing. Evelyn insists that ingredients you can buy at any supermarket are high-end. Furthermore, she's such a miser that she takes everything home without leaving a scrap. My mother-in-law was shocked to discover not only that her husband knew about the supplier talks, but also what the staff had been saying. And then my father-in-law dropped a bombshell. I'm fed up with your greed. And don't think I don't know about you stealing recipes from Mrs. Henderson. What? My mother-in-law was left speechless. She tried to remain calm, but her body trembled uncontrollably. It's all lies. Don't believe any of it, she exclaimed in a shrill voice. Previously, my father-in-law had been consulted by Henderson, the assistant. The assistant was distressed because my mother-in-law was presenting the recipes she had come up with as her own ideas. She had said that she would be content if she considered her a partner, but if she was to remain just an assistant, she wanted to be compensated for her recipe ideas. Upon hearing that, my mother-in-law was furious as if she had been set on fire. How stingy can you get? No one would give a hoot if it came out under your name. Don't get ahead of yourself. The revelation left the gathered relatives in an uproar, knowing that Mrs. Henderson had been silenced by her. Do you all trust Mrs. Henderson and my husband more than me? That's ridiculous. That's when my father-in-law pulled out Mrs. Henderson's recipe book. I kept this just in case. It's undeniable proof. My mother-in-law gritted her teeth in frustration, but there was nothing she could do. To punish my mother-in-law, we had already contacted the company, planning to launch a seafood restaurant. My mother-in-law's phone rang. Mrs. Parker, is it true that you took Henderson's recipes? We're going to postpone the seafood restaurant opening. My mother-in-law went pale. You're all so cruel. After all I've done for you, this is how you treat me? It's like you're all ganging up on me. She pretended to be the victim, sitting down on the spot and sobbing loudly. Ignoring her antics, my brother's wife presented the bill. Threw a fit. Wait a minute, I'm your mother-in-law. Charging me? My brother's wife just chuckled at her. Paying for what you eat is just common sense. Even kids know that. Stumped by the young my brother's wife's logic, my mother-in-law was at a loss for words. Not willing to admit her wrongs, she looked around for someone else to blame, and pleaded with the relatives. Can't someone else pay this for me, seeing how much I'm struggling here? Relatives quickly slipped away in hushed tones. Ultimately, the wallet my mother-in-law brought, intending to completely corner her this time, was used. The remaining amount was paid by credit card. My stingy mother-in-law truly hated parting with her money, shedding tears during the payment. In the end, still fueled by anger, I leaked tales of her greedy antics and her theft of recipes to the weekly magazine department at the publishing house where I work. In no time, the news went viral on TV and online. My mother-in-law's reputation as a culinary expert tanked, and my father-in-law decided to divorce her. Meanwhile, my husband, upon learning the truth, repeatedly apologized to me. He sincerely regretted not hearing me out. I asked him to reconcile with my father-in-law in return for my forgiveness. Mrs. Henderson, once just an assistant, was now in the spotlight, replacing my mother-in-law. Being naturally talented, great things are expected of her. Due to all the trouble she has caused, my mother-in-law found herself swamped with lawsuits. However, unable to pay the massive amount in damages, she found herself desperately turning to her childhood home for help. She went to the extreme of relying on her elderly parents' retirement funds. When her relatives found out, she was disowned by her own siblings and family. She is currently working tirelessly as a night security guard at construction sites and as a janitor in office buildings. Upon hearing my side of the story, my husband realized his misunderstanding and finally apologized to my father-in-law. My father-in-law also regretted not mending his relationship with his son. So the three of us decided to start anew, living harmoniously and putting behind the days of being manipulated by that selfish, miserable woman. From now on, we aim to be a family that genuinely respects each other.